World War II. A global conflict that shook nations, toppled empires, and reshaped the world forever. But behind the well-known stories of American paratroopers, Soviet tank divisions, and British pilots fighting the Blitz, lies a chapter that was nearly erased from history. A story of bravery. A story of sacrifice. A story of Africa. More than 1.3 million African soldiers fought in World War II. They crossed oceans, deserts, and jungles. They fought Hitler's armies in North Africa. They battled fascist Italy in Ethiopia. They carried supplies across Burma. They defended Europe when Europe could not defend itself. And yet for decades they were not honored, not acknowledged, not rewarded. Many were never even paid. This documentary tells their story. The story of the African soldiers who fought the Nazis, and changed the fate of the world. In the late 1930s, Africa was a continent under colonial rule. Britain controlled vast regions stretching from Egypt to South Africa. France ruled West and Central Africa. Belgium dominated the Congo. Portugal held Angola and Mozambique. Italy claimed Libya and had invaded Ethiopia. But beneath the political boundaries, Africa was alive with cultures, kingdoms, and nations. When the world spiraled into war in 1939, no African country declared war, because no African country was politically free. Yet when the colonial powers called, Africa answered, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes forcibly, sometimes out of loyalty, and sometimes out of hope for a better future. Africans joined the war for many reasons. Some were promised money. Some were promised education. Some were promised land after the war. Some hoped that fighting for the empire would one day bring freedom to their nations. And others had no choice. In French West Africa alone, more than 200,000 Africans were forcibly conscripted. In British territories, many volunteered, but thousands were also pressured through chiefs and colonial administrators. Regardless of how they entered the war, one thing is undeniable: without African manpower, the Allied armies would have collapsed in several theaters of the war. It was in North Africa that African soldiers first faced Hitler's elite forces. The deserts of Libya and Egypt became one of the most brutal battlegrounds of World War II. German General Erwin Rommel the Desert Fox led the feared Afrika Korps. Opposing him were African soldiers from all over the continent, the King's African Rifles from East Africa, the Northern Rhodesia Regiment Zambia, the Somaliland Camel Corps, the South African Native Military Corps, the Royal West African Frontier Force, Moroccan Goumiers, Algerian Tirailleurs, Tunisian and Libyan troops serving under the French and British banners. They dug trenches in scorching heat. They fought tank battles in sandstorms. They faced Nazi artillery with limited equipment. At battles like El Alamein, Tobruk, and Mersa Matruh, African troops played a crucial role in stopping Axis expansion. By the time the North African campaign ended in 1943, tens of thousands of African soldiers had died, their names rarely recorded. Before the world's attention focused on Germany, Africans were already fighting a major war in East Africa. In 1935, Fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia with poison gas, bombers, and tens of thousands of troops. But resistance came from all sides: Ethiopian patriots, the Sudan Defense Force, the King's African Rifles from Kenya, Uganda, Nyasaland, South African divisions, Nigerian and Ghanaian regiments, Free French African troops from Chad and Cameroon. This was one of the earliest Allied victories of the war. By 1941, Ethiopia was liberated, and the Italians were defeated thanks heavily to African soldiers. Haile Selassie returned from exile. And Africa had struck its first major blow against fascism. The jungles of Burma, modern-day Myanmar, were among the deadliest battlefields of World War II. Malaria, snakes, monsoon rains, and thick forests made the terrain almost impossible to navigate. Yet more than 90,000 West African soldiers from Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Gambia served in the Burma campaign under the British 14th Army. These troops built roads by hand. They carried supplies for days through the jungle. They fought Japanese forces in hand-to-hand combat. They held the line when other units collapsed. One British commander wrote, "Without the African divisions, we would not have survived Burma." When the Burma campaign ended, thousands of African soldiers remained buried in Asian soil, far from home. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, the country was devastated, but its colonies remained loyal. More than 400,000 African troops would eventually serve under the Free French forces. They came from Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea, Cameroon, Madagascar, North Africa. Senegalese tirailleurs in particular became legendary. They fought in Italy, southern France, and even in the final liberation of Paris. Yet their sacrifice often went unrecognized. In one of the darkest episodes of the war, German troops executed hundreds of captured African soldiers, seeing them as inferior enemies. Still, African units continued to push the Germans back. When Paris was liberated in 1944, African soldiers marched proudly, only for photos later to be edited to hide their presence. South Africa played a massive role in the war. More than 330,000 South Africans served, black, white, Indian, and colored. Black Africans, though restricted from combat roles, served bravely as drivers, medics, and support troops, often at the front lines under fire. South African divisions fought in East Africa, in North Africa, in Italy, on oceans across the world. The Battle of El Alamein, one of the turning points of the war, saw significant South African involvement. Yet apartheid policies meant many black veterans returned home without recognition, rights, or compensation. When World War II finally ended in 1945, Africa had paid a tremendous price. More than 40,000 African soldiers died. Many more were wounded. Thousands never returned home. But the world they returned to was not the world they had hoped for. Many received no pensions. Some were denied their rightful military awards. Others returned to lands still under colonial rule. Yet something had changed. African veterans had seen the world. They had fought tyranny. They had discovered their own strength. And many returned with a new idea. If we can fight for Europe's freedom, why can't we fight for our own? The return of African soldiers ignited political change. Veterans played key roles in independence movements across the continent, in Ghana, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Algeria, in Senegal, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Namibia. They had marched under foreign flags. Now they would raise the flags of their own nations. Their sacrifice helped inspire a wave of African independence from the 1950s to the 1990s. Today, many African World War II soldiers remain unnamed. Their stories were buried in archives, their medals unawarded, their voices unheard. But history remembers. They fought in deserts. They fought in jungles. They fought in mountains. They fought in foreign lands for a world that scarcely acknowledged them. This documentary is not just a record of the past. It is a tribute to the African soldiers who fought the Nazis. To the men who helped defeat fascism. To the forgotten heroes who shaped the world we live in. Their bravery changed history. Their sacrifice should never be forgotten.